The Priest and the Warrior, Numa and Tullus Hostilius, Part 2. After the departure of Romulus, Rome stood at a crossroads. A city born in violence and fortified by strength had lost its founder. But the greatness of an empire rests not only on the sword, but on law, faith, and civic order. In this chapter, we see how Rome narrowly escaped internal ruin before finding its second father, a man who taught a nation of warriors to fear the gods. Yet, as we shall see, this era of profound peace was merely the precursor to one of the most legendary and blood-soaked conflicts in the history of Latium, the war with Alba Longa.
Chapter 1. The Shadow of Interregnum. The vacancy of the throne did not bring immediate peace. Instead, it brought a creeping paralysis. At this time, the Senate consisted of 100 men, but the city was divided by bloodlines. The original Romans, those who had followed Romulus, and the Sabines, those who had joined after the peace of Tatius, were at odds. The Sabines demanded a king from their own ranks to balance the scales of power, while the Romans feared that any foreign ruler would slowly erode their founding traditions. As the months dragged on, the city began to feel the weight of its own leaderless state. The surrounding nations watched from the hills, seeing not a rising empire, but a fractured camp of distracted politicians. To prevent a total collapse or a foreign invasion, the senators devised a system called the Interregnum. It was a complex clockwork rotation of power. The 100 senators were divided into 10 decuries. From each decury, one interrex was chosen to hold the supreme authority, the fasces, and the lictors for exactly 5 days. This rotation continued for a full year, but the people were not deceived. They saw through the thin veil of order. They whispered in the markets that they had traded one king for 100 masters. The grumbling reached a fever pitch, and the Senate realized that to keep their own influence, they must provide the people with a singular figurehead. However, they made a strategic retreat. They allowed the people to elect the king, but reserved for themselves the right to ratify the choice, the Patrum Auctoritas. Chapter 2. The Philosopher of Cures. The gaze of the city turned toward a man whose name was synonymous with virtue, Numa Pompilius. He lived in the Sabine town of Cures, far from the intrigues of the Palatine. Numa was a man of austere habits, a student of all laws, both human and divine. In later centuries, many would try to link Numa's wisdom to the famous Greek philosopher Pythagoras, but the timelines do not align. Numa's genius was not imported from across the sea. It was homegrown in the rugged, pious hills of the Sabine country. He possessed a temperament seasoned by the rigorous discipline of the ancients. When the Romans sent their embassy to offer him the crown, Numa did not grasp at it with ambition. He was a man of peace, and Rome was a city of blood. Yet the embassy persisted, arguing that only a man of his stature could bridge the gap between the two factions of the city. Numa eventually accepted, but with a condition that would define the Roman religious tradition. He would not rule unless the gods themselves signaled their approval. The scene of his inauguration was one of profound silence. An augur led Numa to the summit of the Capitoline Hill. Numa sat upon a stone facing the south. The augur, with his head covered, took a curved staff, the litus, in his right hand. He marked out the regions of the sky from east to west, designating the space before him as the Temple of the Heavens. He then placed his hand on Numa's head and uttered a prayer to Jupiter. O Father Jupiter, if it be thy will that this Numa Pompilius, whose head I hold, should be king of Rome, give us certain signs within those limits which I have marked out. The assembly waited, breathless. When the flash of birds appeared in the proper quarter of the sky, Numa was declared king. He descended from the hill not as a conqueror, but as a high priest. Chapter 3. The King Who Closed the Gates. Numa's first challenge was the most difficult any leader can face. He had to change the very nature of his people. Rome was a city reared in war, and Numa knew that without a constant enemy, they would turn their violence inward. He decided that if he could not give them a human enemy to fear, he would give them a divine one. He began by building the Temple of Janus at the bottom of the Argiletum. This temple was the heartbeat of the state. Its open doors meant Rome was at war, a signal to the soldiers to be ready. Its closed doors meant peace with all neighbors. During Numa's 43 years on the throne, the doors of Janus remained shut. It was the only time in the long, bloody history of Rome that the city knew such an extended, unbroken peace. To solidify this peace, Numa embarked on a massive restructuring of Roman life. He understood that a king's word is transient, but a ritual is eternal. He claimed to have secret midnight meetings with the goddess Erasure in a sacred grove. Whether he truly believed this or merely used the story to lend divine weight to his laws, the result was the same. The Romans believed their laws came directly from the heavens. He reorganized the calendar, which had previously been a chaotic 10-month system. Numa introduced 12 lunar months and inserted intercalary months to align the calendar with the solar year. He designated fasti and nefasti days, creating a rhythm for the city where religion and statecraft were inseparable. He established the Flamines, special priests for Jupiter, Mars, and Quirinus, ensuring that the gods were always honored by men of high status. He created the Pontifex Maximus, the bridge builder between the human and the divine, to oversee all religious ceremonies and prevent any neglect of the sacred rites. Perhaps most famously, he instituted the College of the Vestal Virgins. He selected young girls to guard the eternal fire of the city, granting them immense social prestige and legal independence, but binding them to a vow of 30 years of chastity. To Numa, the fire of Vesta was the soul of Rome. If it went out, the city would fall. Chapter 4. The Shield from the Sky. One of the most atmospheric legends of Numa's reign concerns the Ancilia, the sacred shields. It is said that during a time of pestilence, a bronze shield fell from the clouds into the hands of Numa. To prevent this divine gift from being stolen, Numa commissioned a skilled craftsman named Mettius Fufetius to make 11 identical copies. He then created the Salii, the leaping priests of Mars Gradivus. Every year in the month of March, these 12 young men of noble birth would process through the city, dressed in embroidered tunics and brazen breastplates, carrying the 12 shields. They performed a rhythmic, three-step dance, the Tripudium, and sang ancient songs, their movements a strange blend of military drill and religious ecstasy. Through these rituals, Numa transformed the Roman soldiers' instinct for violence into a disciplined service to the gods. When Numa died in 673 BC, he left behind a city that was no longer a collection of huts and bandits. He had given Rome a soul, a calendar, and a sense of destiny. But the peace of Numa was a fragile thing, and the man who followed him was the very embodiment of the storm. Chapter 5. Tullus Hostilius and the Return of the Sword. After the death of the peaceful Numa, the pendulum of Roman history swung violently back toward war. The people elected Tullus Hostilius, the grandson of the man who had fought beside Romulus. Tullus was younger, more vigorous, and possessed a spirit even more warlike than that of the founder. He viewed Numa's peace as a disease of the soul, a rot that was making the Romans soft and stagnant. He did not have to wait long for a pretext. On the borders of Roman and Alban territory, peasants began stealing each other's cattle and crops. It was a common occurrence, but Tullus saw it as a spark he could fan into a conflagration. He sent ambassadors to Alba Longa to demand restitution, but he gave them secret orders. They were to demand immediate satisfaction, knowing the Albans would refuse. This allowed Tullus to claim that the Albans were the aggressors, and that the gods would therefore favor the Roman cause. The Albans, led by their king Cluilius, responded in kind. They marched into Roman territory and dug a massive trench, known for centuries as the Cluilian Trench. But in a strange twist of fate, King Cluilius died in his tent before a single spear was thrown. The Albans appointed Mettius Fufetius as dictator in his place. Mettus was a man of cold calculation. He saw the Roman army and the Alban army facing each other. Two nations of the same blood, speaking the same language, sharing the same gods. He realized that a full-scale battle would be a mutual suicide. Furthermore, he knew that the Etruscans, the powerful neighbors to the north, were watching. Whoever won the battle between Rome and Alba would be so weakened that the Etruscans would simply move in and finish off the survivor. Mettus requested a parley. He met Tullus in the space between the two camps and proposed a different way to settle the dispute. "Let us find some way," Mettus argued, "by which it may be decided which nation shall be master of the other, without the massive slaughter of both." Chapter 6. The Duel of the Triplets. By an incredible stroke of fortune, there were in each army 3 brothers, triplets, who were of equal age and strength. In the Roman ranks were the Horatii, in the Alban ranks, the Curiatii. A formal sacred treaty was drawn up. The kings of both sides invoked the gods to witness the pact. The nation whose champions won this duel would hold peaceful and eternal sovereignty over the other. The 2 sets of brothers took up their arms. They were not just fighting for their lives, they were fighting as the living embodiment of their countries. The signal was given. The 6 young men charged. The sound of their swords clashing against shields rang out over the silent, terrified armies. Within minutes, the situation turned dire for Rome. 2 of the Horatii were cut down, their bodies falling one upon the other. The 3 Curiatii were all wounded, but they were still standing. The Alban army erupted in a roar of triumph. The lone surviving Roman, the last of the Horatii, stood surrounded. But the Roman was unhurt. He knew he could not face 3 men at once, so he used his greatest weapon, his mind. He began to run. The Albans, thinking he was fleeing in cowardice, pursued him. But because of their wounds, they could not keep pace with each other. They became strung out in a long line. When the Roman saw that the first Curiatius was far ahead of his brothers, he turned back with a sudden savage ferocity. He slew the first before the others could reach him. He then ran toward the second brother, who was limping from a leg wound, and dispatched him. Finally, it was down to 1-on-1. The third Curiatius was exhausted, bleeding, and demoralized by the sight of his fallen brothers. The Roman cried out, "2 I have offered to the shades of my brothers, the third I will offer to the cause of this war." He plunged his sword through the Alban's throat. Rome had won. The Albans, according to the treaty, were now subjects of the Roman king. Chapter 7. The sisters' lament and the father's plea. The triumph was immediately stained by tragedy. As the victorious Horatius marched back toward the city gates, carrying the spoils of his enemies, he was met by his sister. She had been betrothed to one of the Curiatii. When she saw her fiancé's military cloak, which she herself had woven, draped over her brother's shoulder as a trophy, she did not cheer. She collapsed in tears, screaming the name of her dead lover. Horatius, still fueled by the adrenaline of battle and the pride of victory, was disgusted. To him, her grief was a betrayal of the state. He drew his sword and stabbed his sister to death in front of the crowd, shouting, "So perish every Roman woman who mourns a foe!" The city was horrified. Even in that brutal age, the murder of a sister by a brother was a horrendous deed. Horatius was arrested and brought before the king. Tullus, unwilling to take the responsibility for either condemning a national hero or pardoning a murderer, appointed duumvirs to judge the case. They sentenced him to be hung from a barren tree and scourged to death. But Horatius appealed to the people. His father stood before the assembly and pointed to the spoils of the Curiatii. "Can you endure," he asked, "to see this man who so lately marched in triumph, bound to a gallows? Where can you hide him from the sight of his own glory?" The people, moved more by the father's courage and the son's service than by the abstract requirements of the law, acquitted him. However, to satisfy the religious need for purification, the father was required to perform certain sacrifices and lead his son, with his head covered, under a wooden beam placed across the street. This beam remained for centuries, known as the Tigillum Sororium, the Sisters' Beam. Chapter 8. The Treachery of Mettus and the End of Alba. The peace between Rome and Alba was a lie. Mettius Fufetius, the Alban dictator, was eaten away by resentment. He had lost his country's freedom without a full battle, and his people hated him for it. To regain his standing, he began a double game. He secretly encouraged the people of Fidenae and Veii to revolt against Rome, promising that when the battle began, he would lead the Alban forces in a defection to their side. Tullus Hostilius marched north to meet the rebels. The armies drew up near the confluence of the Anio and the Tiber. As the Romans engaged the Fidenates, Mettus led his Alban troops away from the Roman flank and up into the hills, where he waited to see who would win. The Roman soldiers saw the Albans withdrawing and panicked, fearing they were being surrounded. But Tullus Hostilius showed the true steel of a Roman king. He shouted at the top of his lungs so the enemy could hear, "The Albans are acting by my order. They are going to take the enemy in the rear." This brilliant lie saved the day. The Fidenates, terrified of being flanked, broke and fled. The next morning, the Albans returned to the camp, acting as if they had been loyal observers. Tullus greeted them with a cold, terrifying smile. He summoned both armies to a general assembly. While the Albans stood unarmed, listening to the king, they were slowly surrounded by the Roman legions. Tullus stood on his tribunal and pointed at Mettus. "If you could learn to keep faith," Tullus said, "I would have kept you alive to teach you. But since your mind is divided between Rome and its enemies, your body shall be divided likewise." He ordered 2 4-horse chariots to be brought forward. Mettus was tied by his limbs to both. The horses were driven in opposite directions, and the man who had tried to play 2 sides was literally torn in 2. It was the first and last time the Romans used such a punishment, as they later prided themselves on being the most merciful of nations. Chapter 9. The Erasure of a City. The punishment of the man was followed by the execution of the city. Tullus ordered that Alba Longa, the mother of Rome, the city of Ascanius, the place where Romulus was born, be leveled to the ground. He did not send his soldiers to loot or burn. He sent them to dismantle. The Roman army entered the gates, and the inhabitants were ordered to leave forever. The scene was one of unparalleled sorrow. The people wandered through their homes for the last time, touching the walls and weeping. There was no shouting, only a mournful silence. As the people were marched toward Rome to be incorporated as citizens, the Roman soldiers began pulling down the buildings. In a single hour, 400 years of history was erased. Only the temples of the gods were left standing. Rome's population doubled overnight. To accommodate the new citizens, Tullus expanded the city to the Caelian Hill and built his own palace there. He enrolled the noble Alban families, the Julii, the Servilii, the Quinctii, into the Senate. Rome was now the undisputed master of Latium. Chapter 10. The Wrath of Jupiter. But Tullus Hostilius had forgotten the lessons of Numa. In his hunger for war and his brutal efficiency, he had neglected the gods. In his final years, a rain of stones fell on the Alban Mount, and a plague swept through the city. Even the warlike king fell ill. In his desperation, Tullus tried to perform the secret sacrifices to Jupiter Elicius that he had found in Numa's commentaries. But Tullus was not a man of faith. He was a man of strength. He performed the rites incorrectly, with a heart full of arrogance rather than piety. The response from the heavens was not a blessing, but a judgment. A bolt of lightning struck the palace, and Tullus Hostilius was consumed by fire, along with his entire house. After 32 years of blood and conquest, the warrior king was turned to ash. Rome stood once again in silence, waiting for a leader who could balance the sword of Romulus, the law of Numa, and the ambition of Tullus.